Hi, my name is Jayreid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and today I'd like to offer some psychological, emotional, and somatic tools for living alongside shame rather than having shame interrupt your life. So today's video is the third in a three-part series on the role of shame in recovery from narcissistic abuse. Shame is a very unique emotion in that it tends to exponentiate the more it's sort of noticed, felt, the more we're sort of occupied with it. And the feeling, the state that it sort of facilitates in our nervous system is that of a freeze. I often think of the way we might think of working with shame as very similar to how in the movie Clash of the Titans, the main character Perseus handled the enemy mythological creature Medusa. Medusa was a mythological woman who had a hair full of snakes, and if you looked at her, you turned to stone. And by the way, I'm quoting the 1981 version of Clash of the Titans, not the one in the 2000s. So I'm dating myself, but I still think that's a really, really good one. And in that movie, Perseus, the protagonist, realizes that, all the sort of would-be heroes who are trying to slay Medusa are getting turned to stone because they're looking at her as they go to, spear her or strike her with their sword. So what he does is he takes his shield, sorry for the spoiler here, but for those who haven't seen it, but he takes his shield and in essence looks at Medusa through the reflection of his shield. And by virtue of doing that, he can walk towards her, back up towards her, and slay her without, turning to stone, which was the whole idea. I think that's similar to how these tactics that I'll talk about today sort of operate in relation to shame. They don't sort of run headlong at the experience of shame and try to eradicate it, but rather they try to notice, register the shame, while also bringing deliberately one's attention to other features of one's experience. By doing so, that interrupts that freezing or even turning to stone function of shame. And in the course of that interruption, it can really sort of allow the person to, again, live alongside it as opposed to it sort of kind of overwhelming and kind of fossilizing the self. A few of the principles I think go across all the kinds of tactics that will be offered today are first one of dual awareness, and that kind of captures what I was just describing, where we want to kind of notice the shame in one sort of pocket, you can think of it as a nodule of our experience, and then find another pocket or nodule of our experience that does not feel the intense shame, and to kind of cultivate what's called a dual awareness. So not one to the exclusion of the other, but sort of one, then deliberately bringing your attention to the other and back to the other. Sort of, again, it's like more than one thing in awareness at the same time. That by itself works against the function of shame because shame tends to try to restrict our awareness and make us sort of solely focused on the shame and the bad feelings that occur to the exclusion of everything else. Shame acts very rapidly, and it can create this sort of like rapid sort of cascade of thinking that reinforces the shame thoughts, things that maybe carry with it that sense of disgust, say, towards the self. They ratchet up and they kind of glom on to more and more other thoughts and kind of create a shame sort of lattice work of just all these different kind of reasons why one should feel even more ashamed. But it happens very quick. And so one of the principles, I think, in working with shame is to reintroduce some deliberate pacing and slowness, because that will help us stay within the band of our nervous system that is known as the window of tolerance, where our arousal level is not too high and it's not too low. One way to know when we're in the window of tolerance is that we're able to feel and think at the same time. We're often too high when all we can do is feel, And I would submit we're often too low when all we're doing is thinking and unable to feel much of anything. So that's just sort of some rationale as to why deliberate pacing and slowness is important. And, in reference to last week, I talked a lot about the attack on self as a way that shame can show up in our daily lives. And, I think that way of coping with shame is particularly relevant to survivors of narcissistic abuse, where they were so often the target of the narcissist's unwanted worthlessness, that this way of coping of attacking the self also had the adaptive value of making their environment survivable with a narcissist who had authority over them, particularly for children who suffered from a narcissistic parent. So these principles that I've just mentioned of dual awareness, deliberate, slow pacing, and staying within the window of tolerance, I think particularly apply to managing a sort of shame-based attack on the self, to which survivors of narcissistic abuse may be prone. Okay, so the first category of tactics I'm going to offer for dealing with a shame-based attack on the self are somatic tactics. And somatic just means something pertaining to the body, our bodily experience. And so first, if you find yourself in sort of a hyper-aroused state due to sort of the encroachment of a shame state, here are a few things that can help to lower that state of arousal and hopefully get within our sort of range in our nervous system that feels more optimal. And again, coming back, like I've said so many times on these videos, is coming back to the breath. Breathing in through the nose and out through the nose for a few just regular breaths. And then you can also inhale to a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, and then exhale through a count of 8. That pacing of the breath actually is intended to mimic the way we tend to breathe when we're asleep, supposedly in REM sleep. So it very quickly can kind of signal to the body that it needs to activate what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the nervous system that functions to dampen our arousal levels, often after they've spiked up quite high. And the other one that I mentioned before is, again, to extend your arms, and this is from Peter Levine. Put your right hand under your left armpit and your left arm on your right deltoid, or right shoulder here. And holding this posture for a while can signal to the nervous system that you are safe. And that, again, can be very antidotal to the experience of shame. Another one is to rub the hands together for a bit. And put your left hand over your heart. I hope that's the side of the heart. It's been a long time since I said pledge allegiance in school. But but the point is you feel the warmth of your hand on your chest, and that too can be a very comforting experience. And another one is actually from the Brett Lyons and Sheila Rubin audio book on shame. So it involves having your feet placed on the ground, whether standing or sitting, and as you're also kind of breathing and inhaling through the nose, exhaling through the nose, is to depress your heel into the floor, whether through your shoe or if you're, have socks or barefoot, on the inhale, and on the exhale to relax your foot. And to do that a few times, 3 to 5, and then to switch to the other foot. This can be a very useful grounding exercise that just kind of gets us settled here and now, which again works against shame, because shame can have this sort of like you're kind of thrust into limbo, cascading through space experience. It's in some ways you feel very ungrounded. So this act of sort of like syncing your breath with this depression of the heel a few times and then alternating to the other heel really counteracts that, I think, in a very useful way. Okay, so that's when you notice yourself kind of ratcheting up and sort of like threatening to get out too high in your arousal from the shame, the anxiety, the stress, and so forth. But what happens when the freeze has taken hold And so you maybe find sort of yourself to be feeling sort of depleted of energy, finding it very hard to do much but sort of say sit in a chair or, stare at a TV show you're not really watching, feeling sort of beset with the state of shame, or not feeling motivation to kind of go and do anything that you might otherwise enjoy. Here's where the somatic approach can really involve more energizing tactics. And for that, I highly recommend this practice of Quigong, again, Qigong. This is a Chinese practice that, and I'm not super familiar with it, but from what I've understood, its function is to really harness our life energy through a series of movements that are fairly gentle movements, but are very effective in sort of gently rousing ourselves from that freeze state that shame, can create into a more kind of movement and flowing state. And I'll put the link to a 20-minute daily Quigong practice that I think can be really, really useful. There's also another YouTube video called it's a yoga series by a woman named, the whole series is called Yoga with Adriene. And there's a particular 15-minute video, and I think it's called something like Yoga for When You Are Stuck. That sequence of movements, I think, is particularly good at combating those like kind of frozen, dampened effects of an attack on the self that happens when we're experiencing shame. And one of the most critical ones that is also in the Quigong video is, it's hard to do it because I can't really get up here, but you're sort of twisting while standing up and letting your arms kind of flail from right to left, hitting your torso and your lower back as you come around. I think Yoga with Adriene calls it knocking on heaven's door as the exercise. I'm not quite sure what it's technically called, but that exercise particularly is really good at kind of enervating the nervous system when it's in that freeze state, not requiring too much energy to get going, but then really lets us kind of get into a state of movement. Another one, again, is that the heel exercise of depressing the heel, because, again, it doesn't take a whole lot of movement, but it can really kind of resume the flow of energy in the body. So you've got the depressing of the heel, the Yoga with Adriene 15-minute routine, and the Quigong 20-minute routine that I think are just really, really good to try to develop a regular practice doing. And then if you notice a shame attack encroaching, utilize in the moment. Okay, a psychological tactic for dealing with a shame-based attack on the self. What can be helpful in these cases is, I think, the experience of the shame and the accompanying sort of self-attacking thoughts will be easy to have awareness of. Well, what one can do is deliberately interrupt that and think of a time where you felt very proud, strong, powerful, accomplished, and really, really kind of bring that experience to mind, trying to notice everything you can about that. From there, you might want to think of this as the anchor point. And from this anchor point, then the task is to sort of slowly, deliberately, again, and incrementally, gradually, notice one thing about the shame that was just being experienced. And then, again, bring that attention back to that anchor point. And just continue doing that, where when you notice the next thing about the shame, it's not to solve anything about it or answer any of the thoughts that might emerge or pay more attention than just registering to the feelings that are there. It's just to notice, see them, and come back to this anchoring experience of pride or well-being. And here's an emotional tactic for how to deal with shame, particularly after surviving narcissistic abuse. As mentioned in the last two videos, shame in the context of being narcissistically abused can be particularly useful in inhibiting our anger response towards the narcissist. And what can often happen is that even following a bout of narcissistic abuse, that shame might arise in the context of feeling angry or to continue dousing one's anger. And so one sort of emotional tactic that can help with, again, living alongside the shame as opposed to feeling under it, like buried underneath it, is to notice when we feel angry and sort of to work to kind of build some capacity to experience it. Sometimes when the anger arises, it can feel so sort of searing and almost rageful that the instinct may be to push it away. But if you can kind of breathe with the anger, stay with it, allow yourself to have whatever thoughts and maybe accompanying feelings are there, or images, and just stay with it. It may come with sort of an impending sense that humiliation is on the horizon, that you're going to get overwhelmed by someone more powerful, and or you're going to end up being too destructive. But all those are maybe thoughts to be expected and to be kind of breathed along with. As there's more sort of like familiarity with your own bodily experience of anger, it can signal to sort of the body's use of shame that it's no longer so necessary to invoke every time we feel angry. And as mentioned before in the video on reclaiming one's anger after narcissistic abuse, I think working in therapy also can be very helpful in this regard, because it offers that relational bridge where, you know, someone can sort of recognize and support and affirm your right to be angry, and it no longer having to be something that has to be coped with in isolation, feeling angry and then the consequent shame. Well, thanks for tuning in this week and to this whole 3-part series. I hope that parts of it have been helpful. And, you know, today we really focused on the somatic, psychological, and emotional tactics for living alongside with shame rather than feeling buried underneath it. Thank you, everyone, again, for the continued involvement with each other in the comments, and for your very kind feedback on the videos. It's just means a tremendous amount to me to know that you found these helpful, and I just really appreciate everyone's continued participation. Well, thanks again, and I'll post again next Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take good care.